You'll never belong here. Just look at her. A nobody, pretending to marry into billions.
Their words sliced through her heart. But what they didn't know? Tonight, she would end it all, with a single decision worth $950 million. The ballroom was silent, so silent you could hear the sound of crystal glasses trembling against the white linen tables. Dozens of guests, business partners, and journalists leaned forward in their chairs as the bride stood at the center, her hand trembling, the pen hovering just inches above the contract that could save the groom's family empire. Her gown shimmered under the chandelier light, but her face carried a weight that no fabric could conceal. She looked at the man who once promised her love, who once held her hand as though she were his whole world. And yet tonight, in front of everyone, she would show him who truly held the power. What no one in that room could have imagined was that the woman they mocked, the woman they dismissed as nothing more than a charity case, was about to pull the thread that would unravel generations of wealth and pride in an instant. Guests whispered nervously, unaware of the storm gathering behind her steady gaze. Was this hesitation? Was she afraid? Or was this the moment the story of her life would change forever? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Her name was Emily Carter, a young woman who, to the outside world, seemed to be stepping into a dream most people could hardly imagine. She was engaged to Daniel Hawthorne, heir to one of the most prominent family empires in the country. Their story, at least as the headlines told it, was something straight out of a magazine. A humble woman from modest beginnings capturing the heart of a billionaire heir. The photographs were dazzling, hand in hand under glittering lights, smiles so perfectly staged they could almost make you forget the whispers that followed her wherever she went. But behind the polished images and the carefully worded press releases, the truth was far less perfect. At the heart of the Hawthorne estate, surrounded by chandeliers that reflected every flicker of candlelight, Emily sat at the long engagement dinner table that would define the course of her life. And though her place was marked with gold-edged menus and her name in calligraphy, she could feel the weight of eyes on her, judging, dissecting, dismissing her existence with every glance. Daniel, her groom-to-be, played the part of the charming host effortlessly. He moved between tables, shaking hands, laughing easily, filling the room with a charisma that always seemed to silence questions before they could even be asked. But not everyone was convinced. Victoria, his mother, sat at the head of the table, her diamond necklace gleaming as though it were another crown on a queen who never intended to step down. Her voice was soft, but sharp enough to cut. To her, Emily was nothing more than an interloper, someone who would tarnish the legacy she had worked decades to build. Beside her sat Chloe, Daniel's younger sister, with the same cold smirk that often followed cruel words. Where Victoria's disdain was deliberate and controlled, Chloe's was playful, mocking, and designed to humiliate. Between the two of them, every word Emily heard carried a sting, every silence carried a judgment. What the Hawthornes didn't know was that this dinner wasn't just a celebration. It was a battlefield dressed in silverware and champagne. For Daniel's family, it was the night to prove that Emily didn't belong, to reinforce that she would never rise to their level. But for Emily, this was the night she chose to remain silent, for now. Because beneath her calm smile and lowered gaze, she carried a truth that could change everything, a truth hidden not out of fear, but out of patience. Daniel's family believed she was marrying up, that without them she would be nothing. They didn't realize she had the power to collapse their empire with a single word. And as the orchestra played softly in the corner and laughter floated through the glittering hall, a storm quietly built in the silence of Emily Carter's heart. The clinking of cutlery and crystal filled the hall, but beneath the surface of the polite chatter lurked words designed to wound. Victoria leaned back in her chair, her voice smooth but loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "It must be overwhelming for you, Emily," she said, swirling the wine in her glass with deliberate elegance. To come from nothing and suddenly find yourself here, among people who've built legacies for generations, I do wonder if you can keep up. Laughter rippled softly through the table, and Chloe leaned in, her smile sharp. It's cute though, isn't it? A Cinderella story for the papers. Too bad we all know how those fairy tales end. The chuckles grew louder, each one piercing Emily's heart like a pin pushed deeper into fabric. She kept her hands still on her lap, her breath steady, her eyes fixed on the candlelight instead of their smirks. Daniel raised his glass to signal another toast, his grin polished for the cameras, but he said nothing. Not a single word to shield her from the humiliation that dripped into every corner of that room. But what no one at that table knew was the truth about who Emily really was. When the applause faded and guests began to move toward the bar, Emily slipped quietly through a side door. The cool night air wrapped around her as she stepped onto the balcony, her chest heaving with the effort of keeping her tears from spilling in front of them all. The city stretched below, alive with light and sound, but she felt utterly alone. She gripped the railing until her knuckles whitened, the sting of Victoria's words echoing in her ears. Moments later, the door clicked shut behind her. Daniel walked out, glass of champagne in his hand, his smile worn thin now that no cameras were around. "You disappeared," he said lightly, though the edge in his tone was unmistakable. Emily turned, her voice trembling. "Why didn't you say anything? When they mocked me? When your sister laughed? When your mother called me unworthy? Why do you let them tear me apart?" Daniel sighed, as though her words were an inconvenience rather than a plea. He set his glass on the stone ledge. "It's just talk, Emily. Don't take it so seriously. They don't mean anything by it." Her throat tightened, her heart aching as she whispered, "But it hurt." For a fleeting moment his eyes softened, but just as quickly the mask returned. "You're too sensitive," he muttered. "Besides, people love this story. Me, the heir, and you, the common girl. It makes me look good. It makes you unforgettable." The words stung worse than silence. She searched his face for the man who once promised her forever, but all she found was distance. By the time they returned to the hall, the evening had shifted into a cruel theater. Chloe drifted to Emily's side, glass of red wine in hand, her grin too wide to be innocent. "Oh, Emily," she said sweetly, brushing at the sleeve of her own gown as if adjusting it. "That dress is lovely. Let me help you with it." And before Emily could react, Chloe stumbled forward, tilting her glass just enough to send a cascade of crimson spilling across the pale fabric of Emily's gown. Gasps filled the room as the stain spread like fire, dark and impossible to ignore. Chloe pressed a napkin to the fabric, feigning concern. "How clumsy of me," she said with mock sincerity, her eyes sparkling with amusement. The guests exchanged uneasy glances, some chuckling quietly behind their hands. Emily stood frozen, her heart pounding in her ears, the humiliation burning hotter than the wine soaking her dress. She lifted her gaze to Daniel, begging silently for him to defend her, to say anything at all that might make this less cruel. But Daniel only smirked, raising his glass. "Careful, Chloe," he quipped, his voice dripping with amusement. "People might think you did that on purpose." Laughter erupted once more, and in that moment, Emily understood the depth of her isolation. Emily's silence was her shield, but it was also becoming her prison. It was later that same week when the whispers became too loud to ignore. Emily had tried to convince herself that Daniel's cruelty was only pressure, that his distance was temporary, that behind the polished facade still lived the man who once held her hand under the stars. But as the days turned into restless nights, doubt gnawed at her heart. One evening, returning earlier than expected from a charity event, she stepped into the quiet of their penthouse and heard his voice before she saw him. It was softer than usual, warm in a way it hadn't been with her in months. She froze just beyond the sitting room, her hand pressed against the wall, listening. "Yes, I miss you too," Daniel whispered into the phone, his tone tender, almost pleading. "I promise soon. Just be patient." Emily's chest constricted as though the air itself had been stolen from her lungs. She stepped forward, her heels clicking against the marble. Daniel turned sharply, his smile vanishing as their eyes met. He ended the call in a hurried breath, slipping the phone into his pocket. "Who was that?" Emily's voice cracked, but she forced herself to hold steady. His jaw tightened, his eyes flickering with the smallest trace of guilt. "No one, just business." But she knew. She had seen the shift in his face, heard the truth in his voice. The name surfaced uninvited, bitter on her tongue. Isabella. The woman his family always wanted, elegant, wealthy, the perfect match in their eyes. And now she knew Daniel had never let her go. Emily's heart ached as she stared at him, searching for denial, for anything that would prove her fears wrong. But Daniel wouldn't meet her eyes. His silence spoke louder than words ever could. She felt the ground beneath her tilt, her illusions breaking piece by fragile piece. Every cruel laugh from Chloe, every cutting word from Victoria, every moment Daniel had failed to defend her, they were no longer burdens she could excuse. They were warnings she had ignored. Now the truth stood bare in front of her, undeniable. The man she loved was still tethered to the very woman who embodied everything Emily was not. For the first time her hope faltered. For the first time she wondered if love was ever truly there at all. Ladies watching this, I want to ask you, how would you feel if the person you gave your heart to, the person you trusted above all, kept another woman in the shadows of your life? Could you forgive that betrayal, or would it shatter you completely? If you're still here and feeling Emily's pain, drop it in the comments. Let's see who's really watching to this point. The following morning, the doorbell rang at the penthouse just as the city was beginning to stir. Emily, still weary from the night before, opened it to find Victoria standing there, wrapped in her tailored coat, her chin held high as though she were entering a boardroom rather than her future daughter-in-law's home. Without waiting for an invitation, she stepped inside, her heels clicking sharply across the marble floor. Emily followed in silence, clutching the edges of her robe as though it were armor. Victoria turned slowly, her eyes sweeping over the living room, her presence commanding, her expression carved with disdain. "Let me be clear," she began, her voice measured and cold. "You're here for show, that is all. My son doesn't love you, Emily. He loves the image of you, the girl from nothing who makes him look humble, grounded, relatable. But convenient things," she paused deliberately, her eyes narrowing, "never last." The words struck deep, cutting into every insecurity Emily had tried so hard to bury. She felt her throat tighten, her palms damp with the effort of keeping herself composed. Victoria adjusted her gloves, her face unreadable, then delivered the final blow. "When the cameras turn away, when the contracts are signed, you'll be forgotten, replaced by someone who truly belongs in this family's world. Don't embarrass yourself by expecting more." With that, she turned, her perfume lingering in the air as the door closed softly behind her. Emily sank slowly into the armchair, her knees trembling under the weight of humiliation. The voice in her head screamed to reveal the truth, to tear off the mask she had worn for so long and show Victoria that she wasn't just a charity case, that she wasn't a story to be used and discarded. She could have spoken her real name in that moment, and everything would have changed. But she didn't. Instead, she pressed her hands together tightly, her chest aching, her pride bruised, yet unbroken. Because even in her silence, something shifted. A small spark glimmered beneath the pain, fragile but undeniable. For the first time, she realized her silence was not just weakness, it was also a choice. Sometimes the people you underestimate the most are the ones holding your future in their hands. Victoria left believing she had crushed Emily, but in reality, she had planted something else entirely. A seed, one that would grow into strength, into defiance, into the resolve that would one day bring the Hawthorne Empire to its knees. But the question remained, how long could Emily endure? Would she reveal her true identity and reclaim her dignity, or would she keep suffering in silence, chained by the love she once believed in? That answer, as the days ahead would prove, was closer than anyone could imagine. The ballroom glowed with opulence that evening, a showcase carefully orchestrated not as a celebration of love, but as a performance for power. Chandeliers sparkled above hundreds of guests, their crystal arms reflecting light onto polished marble floors, while a string quartet played softly in the corner. Every seat was filled by someone who mattered. Politicians, CEOs, investors, and journalists whose pens were poised to capture history in the making. Daniel thrived in this atmosphere, moving through the crowd with the confidence of a man who had never once been denied the world's applause. His arm draped easily around Emily's shoulders as if she were another accessory to his suit, another gleaming trophy to prove his success. He smiled widely for the cameras, his words rehearsed and polished. Here she is, my Cinderella bride, proof that love can rise above class, fortune, and status. The audience clapped on cue, charmed by the fairy tale unfolding before them, while Emily stood quietly at his side, her smile painted carefully across her lips, her heart weighted with truths no one else could see. When the speeches concluded, a group of investors stepped forward carrying a thick folder bound in leather and gilded with the emblem of the Hawthorne estate. On that paper lay the future of Daniel's family, the $950 million contract that would secure their empire for generations. The investors placed it on the grand table at the center of the hall, and all eyes turned to Emily. Daniel picked up the pen with a flourish, then pressed it into her hand, leaning close so that only she could hear. His breath grazed her ear as he whispered, "Sign gracefully. This is what you're here for." Emily's chest tightened as she looked at the ink waiting to spill across the page, her reflection shimmering faintly in the polished wood of the table. The room was silent except for the flutter of camera shutters and the low hum of anticipation. She could feel Victoria and Chloe watching from across the hall, their faces gleaming with smug satisfaction. The investors leaned forward, impatient, ready to finalize the deal that would resurrect the Hawthorne legacy. Emily's hand trembled as she lifted the pen, the weight of the entire room pressing down on her, her pulse echoing in her ears. But then, instead of lowering it to the page, she stepped forward. Her gown brushed against the edge of the table as she raised her chin, her voice steady though her heart raced within her chest. Gasps rippled quietly through the crowd as Daniel's confident smile faltered, confusion flickering across his face. The investors exchanged uneasy glances, sensing that something was amiss. Emily held the pen not as a tool of submission, but as a weapon of choice. And in that moment, the fairy tale they believed they were watching began to unravel. The pen hovered in her hand, but instead of bending to Daniel's command, Emily drew in a breath that seemed to silence even the orchestra mid-note. Her voice, calm and clear, cut through the air like glass. "My name is not Emily Carter," she said, her eyes fixed on Daniel, then sweeping across the glittering crowd. "It's Emily Carter Wyndham, daughter of the Wyndham family, heir to the Wyndham Empire." The words hung heavy for a moment before they detonated across the room. Gasps erupted from every corner of the hall. Cameras flashed furiously, the staccato of shutters blending with the murmurs of disbelief. The investors leaned forward, whispering her name with sudden recognition, their expressions shifting from skepticism to awe. Victoria's face drained of color as she gripped the edge of the table for support, while Chloe's smirk evaporated, leaving only shock etched across her features. Daniel stood frozen, his polished smile collapsing into something far less certain. Emily lowered the pen to the table without a signature, her hand steady, her gaze unwavering. "I don't do business with men who mistake cruelty for love or arrogance for power," she declared, her words sharp, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. The room rippled with astonishment as whispers grew louder, investors exchanging looks of both anger and admiration. The contract, once their salvation, now lay untouched like a relic of a collapsing dynasty. Daniel stumbled forward, desperation overtaking him. "Emily, don't do this," he hissed, his voice cracking as he reached for her hand. "Please, just sign it. We've come too far. You need me. You're nothing without me." But his words carried no weight anymore. His confidence was gone, his empire trembling beneath him. His voice broke further as he dropped to his knees, clinging to her wrist, begging her not to destroy the legacy he had always taken for granted. Millie stood tall, her chin lifted, her hand pulling free from his grasp. For once, the silence that had been her prison became her weapon. She looked down at the man who had mocked her, who had treated her like a story rather than a partner, and she did not falter. The man who once controlled every room was now on his knees, begging at the feet of the woman he mocked. Reporters shouted questions, investors stormed toward the exits, and the glittering ballroom dissolved into chaos. But Emily stood unmoved, radiant and resolute, proving that dignity, once awakened, was far more powerful than any empire built on arrogance and deceit. The ballroom was no longer a place of celebration. It was a battlefield in ruins. Investors pushed back their chairs, their faces dark with anger, muttering curses as they stormed toward the exits. Reporters shouted over one another, cameras flashing like lightning as they scrambled to capture every second of the scandal unraveling before their eyes. The $950 million contract, once the promise of salvation, now lay abandoned, its pages meaningless without Emily's signature. Victoria clutched at her pearls, her carefully constructed world shattering in silence, while Chloe stared in disbelief, her laughter stolen from her lips. And at the center of it all was Daniel, his arrogance stripped away, his mask of confidence shattered. The man who had always commanded rooms now sat slumped in his chair, his face pale, reduced to whispers of pity and ridicule. Within hours, headlines across the nation would call it what it was: a global scandal, the fall of the Hawthorne Empire at the hands of the woman they had mocked. Emily did not wait to see the wreckage play out. She turned gracefully, her gown trailing behind her as she walked toward the grand doors. Each step was steady, deliberate, the sound echoing through the hall as if announcing her freedom to the world. For so long her silence had been mistaken for weakness, but now it was her strength, her shield, and her victory. She did not need to raise her voice, for the truth she had spoken was louder than anything her tormentors could ever answer. And as she passed beneath the chandeliers for the final time, her head remained high, her dignity intact, her heart no longer chained to a love that had never been real. Respect cost nothing. Without it, even empires fall. And Emily had just proven that true power lies not in wealth, but in dignity. If this story hit you like it did us, hit that like button. It helps us reach more people. And subscribe if you want more gripping stories every week. And tell us in the comments, what would you have done if you were Emily? Walk away sooner or wait until the perfect moment?